should F1 start tinkering and getting involved, or the FIA get involved to change the regulations to bring the field closer?
Look what it stays.
Christian Horner consistently at that point would say, look, this is terrible for Formula One. They need to change the rules and let people catch up because it's going to take us years to catch up. And he was actually right.
Almost always when we've had really good seasons, really competitive seasons, it's come towards the end of a regulation cycle.
Well, I'm going to start calling them my wellies then. It's raining in Kentucky today. I can enter in a new word. Hello and welcome to Unlapped. Katie George, Nate Saunders, Laurence Edmondson with you after an action-packed week in Miami. Both of you are at home, I hope recovering after what was 64 ounces of beef you ate, Laurence, while in Miami?
It was something like that. Yeah, we found this wonderful burger place called Le Tub, give it a little plug, in Hollywood, Miami. And it was, these burgers were amazing. And every time I got there, we kept going back evening after evening. I just looked at the menu. I was like, I can't choose anything but the 13-ounce burger. So went pretty big on the burgers over the Miami weekend, which seemed appropriate. But I think my body had withdrawal symptoms afterwards. I got back on the following Wednesday and just felt awful. Anyway, but I've recovered now, ready for another race weekend.
I'm glad to hear it. Nate, how are you feeling before your travels to what is a very rainy Imola?
Yeah, I feel good. I think I managed to avoid the worst of what Laurence got. I missed one night at the Tub, if you remember, because I had TV the next day. So I think that morning alone was key. That early night was key. But yeah, feeling good. I had a few days feeling pretty groggy, and then today I've just been gearing myself up for just getting stuck in monumental rainstorm, which is always fun. My main concern is having to drive in Italy in the wet. There's all sorts of things that could go wrong there, but I'm sure it'll be fine.
All right, well, let's get you set for the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix in Italy this weekend. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, like this video, leave us a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content. And if you're listening, hit us with a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. So we're recording this on a Tuesday afternoon. This is right when F1 personnel have been evacuated from the Imola circuit because of severe weather conditions. What have you guys heard from people on the ground? What have you seen from the images coming out of Imola right now? Because it hasn't just been raining a ton today. It's been raining for the last few days, and it looks like rain's still in the forecast moving forward.
Yeah, there's real concerns over the next 2 days, so Tuesday and Wednesday. If you listen to this on Thursday, you'll probably know what happened. But there's real concerns about floods, landslides, serious weather. And there's also the issue that there is a rather large river that runs adjacent to the circuit, actually right next to the paddock. And if that overflows, it's not overflowing at the moment, but if the rainfall is so heavy, both in Imola and also the mountains where the source of that river is, then that could potentially flood part of the circuit and make it impossible for anything to happen on those days. Now, we are hoping that the worst of the weather gets out of the way Tuesday, Wednesday, and therefore by the time that the media turns up, Nate is going on ESPN's behalf, and the drivers and the teams to actually start the kind of main part of the weekend, which happens on Thursday with media briefings and engineering meetings and so on, that hopefully the worst of it will have subsided. But it really is a case of what damage is done to the track, to the facilities over the next 2 days, and whether that's recoverable in time for the first practice session on Friday and the rest of it. I think probably realistically one of the biggest concerns, assuming we aren't talking about major floods and landslides, is really just to car parks and the spectator areas and people moving in and out of the circuit. It's never been a great circuit for getting people in and out of anyway. Traffic is always a nightmare there, but it could be a huge amount worse because of that. So it really is a case of just having to wait and see. But yeah, we heard today on Tuesday that the preparations in the paddock, which usually at this time of the weekend is finishing off the motorhomes, which the teams take to European races, and getting the garages set up, had to be put on hold. The staff that were working there were told to go back to their accommodation, not because there was a flood in the area, but just because there was that risk, and they weren't entirely sure which way the weather was going to go over the next 24 hours or so.
Nate, do you have rain gear? Can you swim?
I can swim. Well, I haven't swum for a while, but as far as I can remember, I can swim. And yeah, I've got some rain gear. I've worked out I don't have any Wellington boots, which as a Brit is pretty is pretty ridiculous. A British person should always have a pair of Wellington boots at any point. But I've got some pretty good shoes I can wear. But also, I mean, I feel like maybe this is something to do with me, because I was running solo in Belgium 21 as well. And that was when the last time we had super rain like this kind of threatening event. I think Laurence has been to a few in Japan where there's been severe weather storms. But one thing that is quite remarkable with F1 is we have this quite a lot, and bar that race in Belgium, more or less, F1's kind of got away with it. You know, it's amazing the amount of time rain kind of falls after the race. And if you look at the Sunday forecast at the moment, the worst of the rain is meant to be kind of afternoon, evening. So if it does affect the race, it might be late on. But it seems like that's, you know, the worst of it, as Laurence said, is kind of over the next few days.
You mentioned Belgium. Can you kind of just give us the lay of land of what took place in Spa in 2021 and how a rule change was made because of it?
Yeah, sure. So Belgium was crazy. I've never driven through rain as bad as that. I remember going to the circuit, and as a complete side note, I think we've told this story before, but I actually spent 3 days. I missed all the days leading up to that because I tested positive for COVID on arrival in Belgium. It turned out, you know, subsequent tests that had been a false positive, and I was actually negative. And so I finally get into the race on the Sunday, and it was pouring rain that day driving in, and it had rained quite heavily on the Saturday, but qualifying had gone ahead, which has set a grid, which was important for what followed in terms of the result. Now, the rain got worse and worse and worse. From the moment we arrived in the paddock, it got worse and worse and worse right up to the race. We've seen it a few times before. Formula One struggles sometimes to get races going. One of the problems was they would, you know, it's the preparation time of there's a gap in the weather, but we have to prep everything to be ready for it. That happened at Monaco last year, if you remember. They weren't quite sure when the pattern in the weather would break for them, and it was timing the preparations and getting everybody going in time for that. So what we ended up having in Belgium after a massive wait, I mean, I think this went on for 2 or 3 hours, as I remember. They got 2 laps behind the safety car. So it wasn't a racing lap completed. There wasn't anything competitive. Now, quite significantly, in terms of the championship, Verstappen was first. George Russell was second. I believe Lewis, off the top of my head, was third or fourth. But either way, what happened was half points were awarded. Now, that had happened before at events that had been shortened by rain, but it never happened at an event like that where literally no racing had taken place. And a lot of people felt at the time, a lot of the drivers said, their feeling was the 2 laps behind the safety car were completed purely so Formula One could say a race has been completed, points can be handed out. And then there was this massive tug of war between Formula One, the FIA, and the circuit about who owed people money. Anyway, long story short, people said we need money for a refund. I mean by that. Mm-hmm. That then led to this points change, which was confirmed shortly after that. You have to now complete 2 racing laps for any points to be awarded. So that, you know, moves that issue out of the way. And we saw this in Japan last year. This caused confusion for other races. Japan last year finished under a checkered flag, not a red flag. And most people assumed these new rules would apply where, because less than 75% of the race distance had been completed, people didn't feel like full points would be awarded. Of course, Verstappen crossed the line. Everyone thought, okay, he's not world champion. And then he gets out of the car and Johnny Herbert says to him, congratulations, Max, you're world champion. And everyone else is like, is that true? When there was this massive period of confusion. That's the root of that confusion came from the way the points have been changed around, and the key bit that was put into those rules that applies for races that finish under red flag conditions. So when the rain has ended the race prematurely, rather than delaying a race, but it still finishes under racing conditions, if that makes sense. So a little bit complicated, but it makes a lot more sense in the context of what we saw in Belgium that year.
Well, hopefully for your sake and for the sport's sake, the weather begins to clear and it becomes manageable and we have some clear-cut results by Sunday afternoon. Obviously, we know at this point in the season, Red Bull is extremely dominant. There's no denying that. A lot of drivers were asked questions about overtaking or the lack thereof, shortening of DRS zones, how bad the cars are at actually racing one another. And Lewis Hamilton was the latest to kind of sound off on this. And, you know, he said, it's just unfortunate that we still see the same sorts of gaps between teams. I don't know what the solution is for the future, but I think we're going to have to continue to adapt these regulations moving forward. Otherwise, it could be the same as it is now for years or until 2026. Laurence, what did you make of the conversation Lewis had?
Yeah, so there's 2 different arguments here, which I think have got slightly confused both in the media and probably among the drivers as well. Is one is, can cars overtake as well as they should be able to? We had a regulation change in 2022 to allow the cars to race each other more closely, and this year it seems like there's been a slight step back compared to last year. So there's a bit of disappointment about these new regulations. Have they really done what was needed to improve wheel-to-wheel racing? But on top of that, the other thing they've introduced is this new period of Red Bull domination. Now we've seen domination in Formula One again and again. We saw Ferrari in the early 2000s, Red Bull in the early 2010s, then Mercedes for a long period, 2014 to 2020. So that's nothing new, but there's this kind of concern that these regulations are basically set up Red Bull to go and win and win and win. And inevitably, if one team is winning all the time, especially if there's a dominant driver within that team, you don't end up with a championship going down to the final race. And, it's just not as exciting to watch. So, what's the issue here? And really, I think there is a problem that Red Bull have got this far ahead so early in the regulation cycle, but it's no one's fault really, other than the teams that didn't do a good enough job. And so should F1 start tinkering and getting involved, or the FIA get involved to change the regulations to bring the field closer? Probably not. And the other danger is that, regulation changes rarely bring the field closer together. History will tell us that again and again, if you introduce regulation changes, you may end up with a different team leading the pack, but ultimately you do usually end up with one team taking advantage of it and pushing it forward. So I think maybe some of what Lewis said there got mixed between those two arguments. And he also said, about tweaking the regulations to bring it closer together. Well, it's not just the technical regulations. It's not just the cars that are used to do that. One thing is the budget cap that's been introduced and is meant to be giving the teams a more level playing field. Of course, that can also lock in advantages. But the other thing is the aerodynamic testing regulations that we have now, or restrictions that we have now, that basically give more wind tunnel time to teams further down the order so that they can catch up, they can develop more in the wind tunnel, they have more time and flexibility to do that, and therefore they can make steps forward. Now, while Red Bull had some limitations last year, they have an even bigger limitation this year, partly because they broke the budget cap, but also because they were champions at the end of the year. And so I think we have to wait and see how much that really does impact Red Bull's ability to develop. And also, you tend to find as regulations mature, as teams get more and more used to regulations, there's a law of diminishing returns in terms of development. Now, we haven't seen that yet with Red Bull because they clearly made a massive step from 2022 to 2023, but there is a chance that they start to hit a ceiling in terms of their development, while other teams have bigger gains to make. And so almost always when we've had really good seasons, really competitive seasons, it's come towards the end of a regulation cycle when teams have started to converge together. So I think there is a bit of patience involved. Something really had to be done about the cars not being able to race each other, which we saw get worse and worse and worse under the previous regulations. So something was done about that. An unfortunate side effect is now that it's created domination of one team. But again, given time, that can close up. So in terms of the FIA getting involved, F1 getting involved and trying to change the regulations to bring people closer, I don't think that's what's going to happen. I don't really think that's what people want to see happen. What they want to see happen is the other teams get a better understanding of how to improve their own cars and push forward. And we might see bits of that with updates coming this weekend, but we'll get stuck into that a little bit later on.
It's an incredibly hot topic. Every driver and team principal was asked about it down in Miami. So I would ask you this, Nate, because I've entered the sport later, certainly than the two of you. Laurence references the periods of dominance with Ferrari, Red Bull, Mercedes, and now obviously it looks like we're entering into a period of dominance for Red Bull. Was this topic hot during those time periods? Was it constantly in the news and media, just like it is now?
Yeah, and I think that's one thing I saw shared quite a lot. I mean, I'm amazed at the screenshots people are able to compile so quickly on Twitter, but people had found, Christian Horner, and I can remember him saying it. I think I've mentioned before, my first season covering Formula One was 2014. And obviously that season, Mercedes were light years ahead of everyone else. And again, like Laurence said, they had done a better job than everyone else. Everyone else had been, kind of caught lacking. And Christian Horner consistently at that point would say, look, this is terrible for Formula One. They need to change the rules and let people catch up because it's going to take us years to catch up. And he was actually right in that instance. It did take Red Bull quite a long time. I remember back when Schumacher was dominating, it was the same thing. It was like, this guy's killing Formula One. They need to change the rules. They did well, the rules did change, and Ferrari were kind of like, well, this has been done to pull us back to the rest. There was stuff with the tires, etc. But I mean, I think it's part and parcel. Certainly, as long as I've been covering it, the team out in front is the one that everyone says, well, we need to stop these guys from winning everything because at the moment they're too far ahead. So it does seem to follow a cycle. And yeah, I think everything Laurence said is spot on. I think the most worrying thing would be if it did take until 2026 and Max was that dominant. But at the same time, if you're a Mercedes fan, Mercedes had those 3 years, 2014, 15 and 16, where they were pretty much unmatched out in front, and they certainly didn't complain at the time. It was the rest of the field that did. And you can't, after a while you just start playing whack-a-mole a little bit. I'm not sure if that is the right term in America, but like it's a circus when they keep popping up, because you think you've solved one problem and then you create 3 or 4 more by what through doing that. So yeah, I can't see it happening. And hopefully eventually 2021, we'd had stable-ish regulations for a few years, and then that's what we got at the end of that. It took a long time to get there, and the problem was, in hindsight, you're looking at it now, was that immediately following that was a rule change. You wonder what would have happened had we had a few more years of that, of the cars as they were, Max and Lewis being so close together. So yeah, it's not always the answer.
Whack-a-mole, good analogy. I dig it.
It sounded way too English to be something
it's a good one.
Use, but I'm glad it's traveled across the pond.
Yes, it has. Red Bull certainly clicking on all cylinders. Its sister team at AlphaTauri, not so much. Not sure if you saw some of the comments or suggestions that were made that Helmut Marko is not thrilled with AlphaTauri rookie driver Nick DeVries. Is it true? Have we got it confirmed that he did give some kind of warning to Nick DeVries that he needs to be improving here shortly, or he possibly could be replaced later on in the season?
Yeah, it certainly seems so. So I know for a fact that within the team, the word that was used to me by a couple of different people at the team is that they've been underwhelmed by him. Came in with quite a lot of hype last year based on what he did on that debut with Williams. As for Marko, I haven't had that confirmed. I'm not sure Laurence has either, but it definitely isn't out of step with what we've come to expect from Helmut Marko. I mean, he's one of the most demanding people in Formula One. Ex-Red Bull drivers will tell you the most horrifying thing they ever saw on a Sunday evening after a race would be their phone lighting up and says Helmut Marko's calling, because they know he only calls when he's got some harsh way. He very rarely will call you and say, "Oh, you did a great job today." He's usually calling you to say, what the hell are you doing? I mean, Daniel Ricciardo, who funnily enough is in the middle of this story, said that used to terrify him. When that call would come, he said you'd have to answer it on the first or second ring, otherwise he'd have a second reason to be annoyed with you. Not only is he calling you to to have some stern words with you, but he's also like, well, why on earth did you leave this ring for a while? So wouldn't be out of step. And and I think given that DeVries hasn't come in from the Red Bull system, I think there's less loyalty than maybe they've got towards someone like Yuki Tsunoda, who did spend a bit of time kind of not maybe impressing in the way he should have done. But I think he's been given a much longer leash than, say, DeVries has been so far.
That was the exact word I was going to use. It seems like Laurence, he's on a short leash. I mean, he's only 5 races into the season with this new team. Is that fair?
Yeah, he's only 5 races or 6 races now into his F1 career. Because of course, he had that one with Williams last year. Mm-hmm. So this is fairly normal for rookies to take a little while to get up to speed. So I think it is a bit unfair, but it is the nature of the Red Bull system as well. And I think the expectation with Nick was that he would come into the team and hit the ground running a little bit more, just because of his experience outside of Formula One. He's relatively old for a rookie, I think 28 years old, and he had that experience in Formula E. He was a Formula E champion. Mm-hmm. And I think there was just this expectation that by bringing him in, of course, he replaced Pierre Gasly when Gasly made it quite clear that he wanted to go and drive elsewhere. Alpine had an opportunity. And so they brought DeVries in, hoping that he would be able to just get straight in there and get the job done. And that's hard. That's really hard in Formula One. There's an awful lot going on. There can be just the most minute bits of bad luck which spiral into something far worse. And so I think realistically he needs to be given a bit more time, but it's just not the way of the Red Bull driver program, really. They like to keep the pressure on the drivers, and it's a real sink or swim environment. And I feel like DeVries will will improve going to a number of tracks which he probably knows a little bit better. He's done a lot of racing in Europe during his career, so I feel like the next 3 circuits, Imola, Monaco, is a bit unusual, but he has raced there before in Formula 2, and then Spain, which is a track that a lot of drivers know quite well, should give him a chance to settle and hopefully get the results that Helmut Marko is looking for.
Yeah, hopefully so. And Nate, you mentioned Daniel Ricciardo, obviously friend of the show. When these reports came out that Marko was obviously not happy with DeVries' lack of performance thus far, many concluded that Daniel Ricciardo would be in line to take that seat should he be removed. You've debunked those rumors, though.
Yeah, somebody called me the Ricciardo Whisperer on Twitter, which I found was quite funny. Yeah, so it was bizarre because that report came out saying that Ricciardo had gone to Faenza and had a seat fitting there. Wasn't quite true. He had a seat fitting behind closed doors in Miami, which was because Liam Lawson wasn't at the Miami Grand Prix. He's actually AlphaTauri's reserve driver. He's a Red Bull Junior driver. So in the instance that Ricciardo was needed, he obviously needed to have a seat fitting. He had one in Australia for Red Bull. He actually went to Europe for the wedding of Chloe Stroll, sister of Lance, and his friend Scotty James, which was in Venice, which looks unbelievable. If anyone checks out on Instagram, how the other half live is crazy. I was so jealous looking at all those photos.
People said it was the F1 royal wedding. If you're curious,
as close as you're going to get to it. I mean, it seemed like there was a lot of big names there. But on Ricciardo, from everything I know from those close to Ricciardo, and also from people at Red Bull as well, who I spoke to last week when this kind of news was coming out, is there's been absolutely no overtures made to Ricciardo about this seat. Helmut Marko's not spoken to him yet. It's been casually mentioned in conversations like, at some point, we might need you. And I think Ricciardo has kept the same line throughout this, both privately and publicly, is that he's really not that interested in driving anywhere other than one of the top teams. I think that still applies this season. From CAA's point of view, CAA are the guys that represent him, obviously. For one thing that was pointed out to me was that if he was to sit in at AlphaTauri, that's a whole new contract he needs to draw up. He's got a very, very good contract at the moment, which is a lot of marketing opportunities. And obviously he's going to test the car later this year, but it's given him a lot of freedom to do things away from Formula One that I think if he raced, he suddenly has to give some of those things up. There's a lot of things he's doing away from the sport this year. So I just don't see it ever fitting. I mean, in a few races time, he might have that bug and he might say, I want to kind of come back into it. But one thing I was told, just to wrap this up, was that people, I think the riskier option would be seen as taking an opportunity at AlphaTauri. If you go in there and you struggle to beat Yuki, who at the moment is in really good form, which is kind of, I think, has made Nick DeVries' life a bit more difficult. If you go and do that, any chance Ricciardo has of a top line seat somewhere else, I think, is gone. It's pretty slim anyway, I would say. But any chance he had of that, any chance he had of maybe jumping in and replacing Perez at some point, if that eventuality came, I think you'd basically close the door on it. So every indication I have is that if DeVries does go, Liam Lawson, who's currently racing in Super Formula in Japan, would be the guy that would get that seat. If there's a reason Red Bull have their junior drivers, and they would want to support him in that situation. So I know it's a great opportunity, and we'd all love to see Ricciardo racing, but I just can't see an eventuality. Maybe for one race, I think that might be a possibility. If DeVries did go, they're like, right, we need you to jump in this weekend, and then we're going to find someone else longer term. But yeah, becoming AlphaTauri's driver for the rest of the season, I would bet pretty much everything that I'd be willing to bet, because these things can come and hit you in the face. But yeah, I would be stunned if Ricciardo raced there in any meaningful capacity this year.
Regardless, though, a good reason to keep an eye on Nick DeVries moving forward over the next few months to see how he's able to perform. We've set the stage from a weather standpoint at Imola, but let's actually get you ready and preview the race. Multiple teams are bringing big upgrades, Laz. So what should we anticipate from said team? Start with Mercedes, please.
Yeah, Mercedes are the one that have created the most interest in their upgrades, I think, because they were talking about them even before the start of the season. So as early as the Bahrain test, when it became quite clear that the car wasn't performing on the level that anyone at Mercedes wanted, they were talking about what they're going to do to the car in Imola. I think the most visual change will be the side pods. Those infamous zero-sized side pods will be changing in some way. We don't know exactly how. Mercedes has said it's not going to be quite like the Red Bull, which is the team that a lot of people have followed, and it will be its own kind of path forward. But I think the bigger changes in terms of relevant to not only performance on track, but also just the team's development direction going forward is the front suspension and the floor. They've found that the car is really lacking a lot of rear end grip, especially in high speed corners. The center of the aerodynamic pressure that's created by the aerodynamics of the car is too far forward, which makes it very difficult for the drivers to have confidence in the rear end of the car going into high speed corners. So they're trying to address that. They're trying to create a platform that they can load downforce onto, ideally one that can run at a lower ride height than they currently are. Therefore, they'll get more performance out of the floor. So all of these things are incorporated in this new upgrade, and hopefully the drivers will give feedback that they like it. Whether it will result in immediate performance gains is interesting, because it's a relative game. Of course, you're going up against Ferrari, who also bring in performance. Red Bull, which seems to bring some small update to every single race. They might have a bigger one in line for this race as well. So if you've got all the teams bringing upgrades, then even if Mercedes found 0.3 seconds compared to where the car would be previously, and that would be quite a lot in a single upgrade, you might not see it relative to the other teams. So I think really what's key for Mercedes here is that they understand the car a bit better. When they put it on the ground and they make setup changes, it does what they want. They can get into setup changes where they're not making significant compromises like they have at other races this year, and that's the plan. So hopefully it will work, as hopefully with other teams as well, because as we were talking about earlier, that gap between Red Bull and the chasing pack is really not particularly exciting for motor racing and for Formula One going forward. So the best way out of it would be for the teams to develop their current cars to a point where they close that gap. So a lot hanging on this race for Mercedes, but whether you'll see the instant performance or whether it will take a number of races to get there and to optimize the car around the new components remains to be seen. And I feel like it might take a few races still.
Could the upgrades unfortunately be moot points for some teams if the weather is bad?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the 3 practice sessions you have in Imola, teams will be looking to gain as much information as possible. If the weather's bad, that really limits what you can do to some extent and how hard you can push the car. And, because what you want when you're testing new parts is as many variables taken away as possible. So if you have a perfectly dry track at a constant temperature, that's ideal. It's like doing a science experiment. You want to control those variables. Now, if you have a track that starts wet, then dries, or starts dry, then gets wet, you just lose a lot of the comparison. When you make setup changes, it's not directly comparable to what you had before. And so, I think a lot of teams will be hoping for dry weather. But then again, it's kind of the same for all of them, isn't it? So if it takes a couple more races for them to truly get an understanding of it, it will be across the board for any teams bringing big updates. And we're expecting a lot of them to bring updates over the next 3 races. Now we go into Europe. Traditionally, that's when teams start to look at their cars and bring pieces that they've been planning since the start of the year. They've had that lead time to work into those upgrades, and also just the distance between the factory and the racetrack is shorter, and the logistics of getting stuff there is easier. So that's another reason why we'll see a lot of changes to cars over the next few weeks.
Okay. Helmut Marko wasn't the only person chastising his drivers. Alpine CEO Laurent Rossi had some stern words for his drivers as well after Miami. Comments like there will be consequences if the team doesn't improve. Amateurishness, Nate, at times this season. He said the trajectory is not good. We need to fix the mindset of the team ASAP. There's going to be consequences, and it won't wait until the end of the year. What did you make of those pretty strong statements from Rossi?
Yeah, they were pretty strong, pretty surprising as well to hear someone speak that candidly. But I think they're actually more aimed away from the drivers. I think they're aimed at Otmar Safnauer and aimed at the management structure currently at Alpine. I mean, that's headed up by Otmar. Certainly the way that was interpreted by the French media especially was that it was a dig directly at Otmar. And it's pretty remarkable to hear the CEO of a team, especially the CEO of a team that, let's face it, has not done very well, since they came back as Renault in 2016, kind of speaking out like that against the management structure that he's helped appoint, that haven't been, getting the results that they need on track. And And yeah, I mean, Otmar, if you look at Formula One right now, if you were to take bets on who you think the next person to kind of lose a high profile job would be, Otmar seems to be one of the people that you would think. Alpine just haven't looked that good this year. But to go back to your original point, Katie, there, you should read that as a knock. The drivers should have read that as a knock to them as well, because they've left a lot of points on the table this year as well. Obviously, they collided in Australia. Gasly put it in the wall in Baku. The team made a mistake in Bahrain, but then Ocon made a few mistakes when he had that kind of hilarious string of penalties at the first race. So I think just generally speaking across the board, Alpine's kind of in a complete mess behind the scenes. I think they've clearly got a very good race car, and they feel like they haven't optimized that, so far this season. That was certainly what the drivers said, around the Miami race, and they were pleased to kind of have an error-free race and kind of, get the points out of it they wanted. But yeah, just really strange this early in the season to see that. And I think from what I understand from, again, speaking last week to people at Alpine behind the scenes, I think the big thing that's come to a head more than anything this year has been Aston Martin. Coming into this season, the narrative was, hey, we're making good progress. We've beaten McLaren. Alpine looks solidly the fourth best team. And we all thought, well, no one's going to really break that top three. Now suddenly Aston Martin have leapt ahead of them all. Scoring podiums every week. I mean, they've been behind Red Bull. Sometimes they've been the second quickest team. So there's a lot of pressure behind the scenes there. But the last thing Alpine needs is to change things up. I mean, it's probably had the least stability of any team when you look at it from a management perspective. So yeah, I was really surprised to see it. I can't remember a team, a CEO or somebody that senior speaking so candidly about his team. But from what I understand, it didn't go down too well with kind of rank and file members at Alpine, because ultimately they look around and they say, well, a lot of the points have been given up so far by drivers.
Fair enough. You said stability. This is a home race for Ferrari. Miami maybe wasn't the best outing for Charles Leclerc on the weekend on the whole. Laurence, what are your expectations and standards for Ferrari coming in weekend?
Yeah, they also have an upgrade coming, and it's really trying to address some of the issues that Leclerc had in Miami, the difficulty, the peakiness of the car, and then also trying to get it to work in the races. Because on qualifying pace, some races, they've really not been too bad. They've been fairly close to Red Bull, as close as anyone's got to Red Bull this year. If we just look back to Baku, Leclerc took 2 pole positions, both in the sprint and the main race. So there's clearly some performance in that car, but they just cannot get it together during a race. And that's what they're looking to address. Again, you kind of hope that the string of 3 races on more familiar ground, closer to the factory, stuff like that will help. But there's no guarantees at the moment with Ferrari. A number of times in these kind of pre-shows, I've talked about how this should be a good track for Ferrari, and on paper, Imola shouldn't be terrible for them. But they just seem to make mistakes along the way, lose the thread in the race, and that's really what they need to address this weekend, as ever, to get a decent performance.
I think the upgrade needs to just be a car that doesn't spin. That will help Charles out a little bit, and then go from there. You should
suggest that to some of the engineers in F1, because I bet they've never thought of that.
Yeah, I will. I'm going to walk down the paddock in the Wellington boots I find later, and tell them, "Hey, have you thought of making a fast car that doesn't spin?" And they'll say, "Mamma mia! I never thought of that before."
What are Wellington boots, by the way? Is it just a brand of rain boots?
Yeah, so that's an English word, isn't it? That doesn't translate. It's just boots. I don't know why we call them Wellington boots. I guess it's right, yeah.
Wellies. Have you heard of wellies?
No, I mean, I've heard of rubber rain boots.
Same thing.
Okay,
yeah, those, yeah.
Well, I'm going to start calling them my wellies then. It's raining in Kentucky today. I can enter in a new word. I love it.
And people look at you like, what? You say, yeah, wellies. My wellies.
In my English accent. All right, I digress. When it comes to Red Bull, who do we feel like this track suits more? And do we need the fight to stay close over the triple header here in Europe, in your all's opinion?
I think we do need to stay close, don't we? Because Max got more of a lead in Miami after a qualifying and with a grid that looked like it was going to favour Perez. So yeah, we really need it to stay close. Otherwise, it's going to just look very one-sided by the end of this triple header. Unfortunately, I think unfortunately for Checo anyway, Imola is probably a track that's going to suit Max Verstappen. He likes high-speed corners. He likes traditional racetracks, and Imola is a bit of both of those, and also not an easy track to overtake. So if Verstappen does his thing in qualifying and gets a clean lap in, which he didn't in Miami, but if he does it here, then I think he's going to be on his way to another fairly comfortable victory. The one hope for Perez will be Monaco coming up the weekend after. That's the race he won last year. It's a street track. We know that he does like street tracks a little bit more. So even if Max gets ahead of him and wins again in Imola and extends his lead, Perez will be looking to Monaco as one track where he has to peg Max back a bit and kind of take a few points out of him. But it's all just looking a bit one side. I think prior to Miami, we were saying 2 wins each. Checo had the sprint victory as well, and it just looked like there might be a possibility there, but he had such an opportunity in Miami to extend to take the lead of the championship. Really put himself in a position where he could start to ask some questions in the team and make sure that they give him as much support as Max. But now with Max beating him just on outright pace in Miami and no other reason for it, he really needs to perform at these next 3 races.
And the problem we have as well is that we talked about rain earlier. Often, you're like, if rain happens, it could, but we know Max loves the rain as well. So if it does rain, you feel like that's just another kind of, another reason to back Max.
I now want to get your predictions, Lawrence's favorite segment of the show, after sweeping the nation last week in Miami. Here's how it stands, okay? Follow me. Nate, you're 1-2-2. Laurence, you're 1-1-3. Katie's 1-1-1. So by my calculations, Nate, you are atop the standings. I will say, and I don't know how you feel about this rule, because Laurence hit the trifecta, he got all 3 right in Miami. Should we give him an extra win, like an extra point, like you get for fastest lap? Or is that we shouldn't do it since we're 6 races?
Mid-season regulation changes we've just decided aren't a good idea, So I'm against. No, I mean, come on, we can do that, because more incentive for me to try and get it right, and for you, Katie, for both of us to get it right going forward, right? But
so do we want to go back and give him an extra point, or it starts now?
Oh, it's tricky, isn't it? The integrity of this thing is hanging by a thread.
It's getting a little wonky. Dave, you make the call. Give him an extra point or no?
Just because I feel sorry that he had to deal with 60 ounces of ground beef coming
decision.
out of Miami, let's give him the
extra
point.
That was it. It was all on him.
He did it himself.
I mean, he took me along for the ride for 2 days, and I regretted it after the second day. So God knows what he was going through.
I don't regret a thing.
All
right, Laurence.
But I do think it probably is a bit unfair to just add a point afterwards. The only danger with this is that we're going to get some very boring predictions going forward with that.
We're just all going to say Max, Checo, Fernando, just every week.
Which is the only one I've got right so far by just going boring. But anyway, look, I think extra points from now on. Why not?
All right, perfect. So no extra point at the moment. You'll get it moving forward, which means, Nate, you're still in the lead, which means you will now start with your predictions for Imola.
Sweet. So I always hate starting because I kind of doubt my predictions as I go. I mean, I feel like at this point, any one of us that doesn't put Max first is just asking not to score the full points. So I'm going to say Max first.
Max.
I'm very excited about this Mercedes upgrade, purely from the point of view of just what it might do for the season. It might not, as Laurence mentioned, it might not happen overnight, but I'm going to be a believer anyway. And we know when it rains that Lewis he's up there with Max, and we put Lewis second. And then I should really put Checo in third position, but Fernando Alonso owns third position this year, so I'm going to stick him there.
Max, Lewis, Fernando. I love it. Laurence?
So I was going to stick Lewis in the top 3, but now Nate's done it. I might change that and go with Max, Checo. Boring, I know, but I'm going for this extra point now. And then George Russell in third.
Nice.
Okay. That leaves me. I'm writing this down as we speak, so we have a record, of course. In case you guys ever think that there's a dispute and you want to go back on something, I have it in writing. I'm going to go with Max, obviously. I'm going to go with Charles Leclerc. You better not hang me out to dry like he did last week. And Lewis Hamilton.
Nice.
Which means the gap between those two. You think it's good?
Yeah, that would be a mega race for Ferrari, so I'd love to see that.
I would too. Okay, there we have it. Nate, Max, Lewis, Fernando. Laurence has Max, Checo, George Russell. Katie has Max, Charles Leclerc, and Lewis Hamilton.
That's good.
All right. Thank you so much for the time. Keep resting and go for a couple walks to burn off those calories, Laurence. You need to get packing, and I hope that you find your wellies.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad we could teach you that word, Katie, as well. That's if nothing else from this season, that's going to be a high point. Yeah,
and a pinch of salt. Thanks for listening, everybody. Cheers.